going back to Seattle. We went to Seattle earlier with Shawn Kemp. He's going to be part of this too. We're going to look at the 1995 to 96 Sonics. This was, and I remember because I was in middle school at the time. It's my first year of middle school, I believe. This was a very interesting year in basketball. This is the year that the Bulls won 72 games and went 72-10.
Yep.
But the Sonics were really damn good that year. And they kind of were coming into their own the last few years. They had lost to the Suns and then lost to Houston a couple of times. They had their heart broken. They kind of really were ascending. And they had two All-Stars, Shawn Kemp, Gary Payton. Shawn Kemp, the Rain Man, Gary Payton, the Glove, the duo, where they were known as the Sonic Boom. That's what they called that duo back then. And this year was interesting because the Sonics had played pretty well. And then after the All-Star break, they really took off. The team won 30 of their final 36 games. They finished with a 64-18 record, which was the second best record in the league, number one seed in the West. Looking back at this team as I was doing this, Brian, as we did all for this, 64-18, went to their first NBA Finals. They played those 72-10 Bulls. They lost in 6 games. After losing the first 3, came back and won the next 2 and lost in Game 6. Other couple notes about this team. This team was coached by George Karl. Assistant coaches on this team are 2 current head coaches now, Dwayne Casey and Terry Stotts on this team. This is a team that was one of the better defensive teams in the 90s, early to mid-90s. A lot of times people thought about the Knicks. You thought about the Bulls, the Pacers, the Heat. Those teams, the Sonics were really good and underrated. Kemp was good in the post. Gary Payton, obviously great. Won Defensive Player of the Year that year. I believe don't quote me if I'm incorrect on this. He's the last guard to ever win that award. I don't think any guard has won that since. I'm correct on that.
Yeah.
The one thing about this team in the West at that time, and Brian and I will get into this, points per game and pace of play. Okay, this is very interesting when you're looking at teams from the 90s. Now this team played very fast. I remember this from the eye test of watching this as an 11, 12-year-old kid. They played very up-tempo. Gary Payton pushed the ball, looked for Kemp on the fast break a lot. They were third in the league in pace, 93.8 points per possession. Points per game, they averaged 104.5 points per game. Guys, I know for modern NBA, you're like, that's it? 104 points per game? Yeah, they had 104.5 points per game, and that was number 2 in the league, folks. Number 2 in the league for that. Now, we talked about the defense, B. 102.1. So the score 104.5, 102.1, that was second in the NBA in 95, 96. Now, I want to tell people, because that's an interesting time, because if you really think about it, the pace you could tell was actually going up. If you probably look at some of the numbers from 91, 92, 93, 94, where some of the best defensive teams like the Knicks and the Spurs were holding people to 89, 90 points a game on average, this was happening. So you can see the pace starting to go up. Their offensive rating, they were 8th out of 29 teams in the league, 110 points per possession for offense. So they were really good. Now, this is the interesting thing about this team and why I picked them. And we think about how teams fit. All this entire episode, Brian and I have been talking about how guys fit and shooting. Shooting is what is at a premium in the league right now. We know this. This team, for a team in the mid-90s, they had shooters, man. They had shooters. Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton always had a shooter by their side. They were absolutely ready. Hersey Hawkins, who the team had acquired that offseason before from the Charlotte Hornets. For people who don't know, kids out there you don't know, Hersey Hawkins was a really good shooter and a very good scorer early in his career for the Sixers, then played for the Hornets, then got acquired towards the end of his career by the Sonics and had a very important role. Hawkins that year shot over 38% from downtown. They also on this team, head coach in the league, Nate McMillan, 38%, very good three-point shooter. Sam Perkins, one of the big men that really started spacing the game out and was going out to the three-point line, a big man that could shoot the threes. He actually I think he was rocking the dreads at this time and did not play like your typical dread player. If you haven't heard my thoughts on that, that's a whole nother story. He was shooting 35% from downtown. And then the best shooter on the team was a guy who was a very underrated small forward in this era, could give you about 16, 17 a game. Detlef Schrempf, small forward, 40%. Now, here's the thing. It's about attempts per game. This is not a team that shot a lot of threes per game in terms of what we know it now. And the biggest glaring thing on this team to me was their best shooter, Detlef Schrempf, 40% from downtown. He only averaged 2.8 3-point attempts per game. Gary Payton, the Hall of Famer, averaged more 3-point attempts per game than him, 3.7, despite shooting only 32%. So please think about that, people.
Yeah.
Gary Payton, who undoubtedly was the best player on the team, was not the best 3-point shooter on the team. And the coaching staff still was like, it's okay for Gary Payton to shoot almost 4 threes a game. Meanwhile, the best 3-point shooter on the team only shot just under 3 attempts per game.
By the way, while playing 35 minutes a game, Detlef Schrempf. 35 minutes a game out there shooting less than 3 threes.
Less than 3 threes a game, right? Great point to that.
You can't even wrap your head around it.
You can't. It's like mind-boggling. It's like you had one of the best shooters in the league, and you didn't let him shoot more or have to run plays for him to shoot more. Different world. Sam Perkins, which I would have to say, and I remember people saying this at the time, he shot 4.4 threes a game. Now, at the time, nobody really wanted big men shooting threes like that. So you got to think Sam Perkins, who for the most part was a bench player and then came in and started in that finals as center, people probably were like, what's going on here? Nate McMillan shot only 2.2 threes a game, averaging 38%. And Hersey Hawkins, who's probably their most prolific in terms of volume shooter, 4.6 attempts per game. But he was a really good shooter at this time. And they were really great at the corner three. Now, Brian, the question is, considering this team's best players, Kemp and Payton, Sonic Boom duo, weren't great outside shooters, but they had the way you'd kind of want to develop the team around them, right? They had the shooters and the spacing, but they didn't shoot a lot of threes. It's an interesting time. Other thing I'd like to note about the Seattle Sonics team, this was the year that they changed their logo to the cartoony-looking Sonics with the
my
needle.
Favorite.
I do not. Oh, we disagree on that. I absolutely did not care for this. I did not care for this jersey change.
Not my favorite. My second favorite. My favorite one was actually the last one they had,
where they went a little bit back to more of their traditional logo. And I did like that. I didn't like this cartoony thing and the number.
Yeah, the Christmas colors.
To be fair to the Sonics, a lot of teams in the 90s had some cartoony looking jerseys.
Pistons.
We're going to have to go back on that one day and look at like a uniform breakdown of the team. There were some bad jerseys in the 90s. So I didn't like that. What did you think about this team and how they could fit in today? Because I think it's a fascinating team. They were really good defensively, and they had the shooting, but it didn't seem like they used the shooting as much as they should.
So in 1995, 1996, the Nets shot 9 threes a game. Just so we're clear on how the game was being played in some parts of the country. The then New Jersey Nets shot 9 threes a game. They were dead last in the NBA. The Indiana Pacers, so then people can get a grip on like what was really going on at the time. The Indiana Pacers shot 11.9 threes a game. Second lowest or third lowest in the NBA. Reggie Miller took half of those per game, basically. They had Reggie Miller, and they still didn't take more than 12 threes a game, which is very interesting. And then when you're talking about pace, the Sonics were third in pace that year at 93.8. The Cavs were a team that was dead last, 82.3. A Cavs team that made the playoffs, by the way. And
that I'm gonna stop you there, because that's one of those things you have to be there to see it. That is what you call back then a Mike Fratello special.
Yes, that's what it was.
Mike Fratello was his whole offense was about pounding the ball and taking the shot at the last possible second on the shot clock. For Brian,
Columbia Prep used to do this to us when we played them in high school. It was so annoying.
You can't imagine, like, playing it is annoying. Watching games against the Cavs were like the unwatchable team to watch in the NBA of that era. Like, even people of that era hated watching the Cavs because that's all they did.
That's weird because, like, your best player at the time, where your leading scorer at least, was Terrell Brandon, somebody who should be running up and down the floor and playing a fast-paced game, not somebody who should be playing Fratello ball. But anyway, back to the Sonics.
Mike Fratello special, man.
Yeah, but the Sonics and the Celtics were actually first in pace that year, which is interesting. So the Mavericks led the league in three-point shooting. In terms of attempts, they shot 24.9 three-point attempts per game. The Houston Rockets lead the league right now at 44 threes a game. So look at the disparity there. You have the Nets were the lowest at 9 threes a game, and you have the team at the lowest now is in the 20s. So that's just a whole other thing. So for those reasons, I think the Sonics team is interesting because when you look at those guys, Detlef Schrempf, who would probably be a power forward now, we were just talking about Peja Stojaković,
Hmm.
and in today's game, he would be a 4, whereas back then he was a 3. Detlef Schrempf, kind of the precursor to that, although Peja was obviously a much better version. Detlef Schrempf would be a 4 today. He'd be a stretch 4. I wonder if you would play this team differently because, and I think you would because I think Shawn Kemp is your center now, right? I think Shawn Kemp is your center. You have
And
Detlef Schrempf as your 4. And I mean, even though Irvin Johnson was a starting center, he wasn't somebody that was playing big minutes at the time, you know?
they really had no center. It was Irvin Johnson and I'm forgetting the dude's name. White dude with a B for his last name. That was their backup
Frank
center.
Burkowski.
Frank Bukowski.
I would
Yeah.
not want Brick in my name if I'm a basketball player, by the
Yeah,
way.
he was kind of like, he's a guy that came in. He could give you 5 fouls a game. That's what you can count on him
Yeah.
for. He's gonna get those 5 fouls a game. But they
Quiet as
didn't.
kept, there were a lot of those centers in the NBA
But
back
you,
then.
but what's crazy about you think about stuff and forward thinking. I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because I think that's a great point. Their best lineup probably would have been Kemp at the 5,
Yes.
Schrempf at the 4. You could have put Hersey Hawkins maybe to play the 3, and honestly, their best 2 would have been Nate McMillan, who used to come off the bench. He played a good role and put him at the 2.
Play
That
good
probably was their best.
defense.
Play good defense. That backcourt could lock anybody up, and you had some shooting with him. You could have been okay.
Yeah, and Sam Perkins is what he was listed 6'9", 235. That's kind of a prototypical stretch 4 nowadays, who would even play some small ball 5, depending on how small you would go. So I think, Sam Perkins and Detlef Schrempf, you probably alternate them the entire game. Or maybe and there are probably times where you actually play them side by side. Because if Shawn Kemp is going to take a minute, you have to put him on the bench for 14 minutes a game, let's say, because if he's averaging 34 minutes or so, because guys don't play as many minutes as before, you don't see guys playing 40 minutes. So what you're probably doing is you have Shawn Kemp playing center, and when he's not on the floor, if you're not putting in Irvin Johnson to be the backup in this case scenario, you're probably going to have Detlef Schrempf and who did I just mention? Detlef Schrempf and Sam Perkins, there you go. Sam Perkins
Perkins,
playing
yep.
together. You're gonna have Detlef Schrempf and Sam Perkins playing together. Hersey Hawkins is gonna be at the 3. Nate McMillan will be your 2. Gary Payton will be your 1. Eric Snow will be your backup. He was the backup on that team, and then you're ready to roll. You're gonna have and look at what we're mentioning here. We have Detlef Schrempf. You have shooting everywhere because that's your 5. You know what I mean? Instead of having Irvin Johnson sort of clog the lane, and when Shawn Kemp is out, when Shawn Kemp is off, you're probably playing 5 out at that point.
Yeah, I think what happens, you look at that era, is centers were dominant in the game, and so people were so much afraid of the big man that I think that sometimes they didn't adjust to the teams that didn't have the big man, and that's what it could. I wonder if they had went to that in that 95-96 finals, how much more fascinating that could have been, because the Bulls were a team that won all these championships and never had a dominant big man. You were talking about Luke Longley and Bill Wennington. I mean, Shawn Kemp could have held it. They were more scared of Shawn Kemp than anything.
Yeah.
So I think that it would have been fascinating to see, but I feel like a lot of people were stuck in traditions, as we know, can get people in a lot of problems and things, and didn't really deviate. And I think the reason we've seen basketball accelerate a lot more in the last 10 plus years or so is people have been willing to try a lot more new things and not stick to norms and not say that only certain people can shoot threes. But this is a team, I think, in my opinion, with modern coaching today, if you took one of their 2 assistants now, Terry Stotts or Dwayne Casey, and you told them to coach this team even today, I think they would use a lot of the pieces differently. I think you would see a lot of these guys shoot more team. In a weird way, they're actually well structured to win today because they have the defensive attributes. There's some things you might like more out of Shawn Kemp as your number 2 guy, but they have the basis of a good defense. They could switch a lot on stuff if you played small. They had shooters. So they could played well today. They kind of fit in what it is today. I think there's a couple things you tweak, but I think this is a team that could actually work well in the modern NBA.
Yeah, I agree because if I put the 95-96 Sonics in a time machine and, fast forward them 25 years and they're in today's NBA, they're not only shooting 19 threes a game that they were that season, which, by the way, they were 4th in the NBA in 3-point attempts at that point. You're probably...
And I still think it wasn't enough. That's the point I'm saying. They were 4th in the NBA in 3-point attempts, and I still don't think they shot enough.
Right, and look, and we could even get into that with some other teams of the 2000s who probably should have shot more. Like, this goes even further back to that, Larry Bird, we think of him as a 3-point shooter because he won the 3-point contest. He wasn't somebody that shot a ton of threes in games. And if he did, we'd probably think of him even differently than we do now. So if you look at the Sonics, and instead of 19 attempts, even 29 attempts would be too little, because that's still putting you toward the bottom of the NBA. Let's put them in the middle of the pack, and let's say they're shooting 35 threes a game right now. If they're shooting 35 threes a game right now with the rotations that we sort of laid out, where Shawn Kemp is now your center, you have Detlef Schrempf, you have Sam Perkins, you have Hersey Hawkins, you have Gary Payton. That's your starting five. And then when Shawn Kemp goes, Detlef Schrempf slides to the 5. You probably have some other things going on with some other shooters, but you're playing the shooters to their strengths. You're talking about a team that, all right, they're in the Western Conference now. They'd be well equipped against, I think, even some of the elite teams because of how well they could defend, which you alluded to also.
I might argue that if you had these teams, if you took that same roster and they were put in today's game, I don't even think Shawn Kemp's your second best player. I think Detlef Schrempf would actually be your second best player.
Really?
Yeah, because he would shoot more. He's so efficient and he's a matchup problem at the 3 or 4. I think he would actually be your second best player.
So let's play this out under today's sort of rules, right? Western Conference semifinals, 2 versus 3. Let's say the Clippers are the 2nd seed and the Sonics are the 3rd seed. Like, how does this go? Because with the Clippers, you're going to see some lineups where it's not really going to be the power forwards of old necessarily. You're going to see like Kawhi and Paul George as your 3 and 4 with Montrezl Harrell as your 5, some Zubac in there.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. If they matched up, the Clippers are too good defensively and would switch. They have too much size in the way they could switch over them. Like Paul George and Kawhi are still too much of a nightmare for like Hersey Hawkins or Nate McMillan, as good as those players were. So I think that size would give them a bit of an edge, and then what they could bring with like Marcus Morris and even with Montrezl Harrell. Although I'd love to see Montrezl Harrell banging down there with Shawn Kemp. Yeah, I'm here for that. Like, because that would be good. 2 dudes just angry, like trying to jam on each other. Yeah, that's cool.
That's my kind of game. Yo.
Now I think that would be a good series. I even think a good series to look at with that team would have been what the Clippers were during the Lob City era versus this Sonics team. Now, they obviously have a rim runner in DeAndre Jordan that I think could give that Sonics team some problems, but you might argue the Sonics had some better shooting than them, and if they were allowed to shoot more, it would have been interesting. I really wonder, and I hope one day I'm going to get to ask this some coaches, some of these coaches like George Karl, I wonder if they sit up at night and think, damn, yo, I kind of wish I made my team shoot more threes.
Yeah.
Like, I wish I'd put Shawn Kemp at the 5 in the 96 finals. Like, I wonder if they think about things that keeps them up or, they've kind of moved on. Either way, it's always fascinating and interesting.